The final session of today, this isn't it, we'll talk a little bit about the success of The Housemaid. And a number of things were seemingly noticeable about The Housemaid, including the extent to which it met and served the interests of female audiences. And I'm very hopeful we'll get to a point where meeting the needs of female audiences will not be an unusual thing. If we look at our industry, the gender balance is better than it was when I started, but still has some way to go, I think it's fair to say. And that kind of permeates for a whole range of things. There are a number of initiatives and projects intended to help redress that balance, and one of the key ones is Reclaim the Frame. So we're delighted to welcome Melanie Iredale from Reclaim the Frame to talk a little about the project and what it does. Melanie.
I'm going to say sorry to Tony from Barco because it was me who lowered the microphone in tech check. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Afternoon, everyone. And thank you to Phil and everyone from UKCA for the invite, my first UKCA conference. So, let me start by telling you why I'm here. I feel like Phil set this up, but... So, last year, only 16% of films released theatrically in the UK and Ireland were directed or co-directed by women or non-binary filmmakers. Only 19% written or co-written by women or non-binary screenwriters. And just 7% were by women of colour, directed by women of colour. Reclaim the Frame exists as an intervention tackling this imbalance. Having evolved from Bird's Eye View Film Festival just over 20 years ago, our charity has grown into the UK's leading campaign for gender equity in cinema, working year-round, nationwide and beyond. Our training, mentoring and talent development programmes support women and filmmakers of all marginalised genders to get their films made, released and seen. Our new release campaigns and audience engagement initiatives ensure these films actually reach the audiences they deserve. When Ava DuVernay referred to Reclaim the Frame as a global movement to centre the voices of folks on the margins, she was speaking not only of the filmmakers that we support, but also the audiences we serve. And a fundamental to our success so far has been partnerships. So it means a lot to be here sharing this with so many collaborators in the room. As Reclaim the Frame, and since 2018, we've been working with over 25 UK distributors. And thank you to those of you that are here. And have built a network of 20 plus cinemas in 16 cities nationwide. And again, thank you, because I know I can see some of you here. Supporting around 20 films by women and marginalised gender filmmakers each year. Our slate is a broad one, as you can see from just a small snapshot of titles here, and an intersectional one. And around half the films that we support are debuts, alongside sustained support for filmmakers making their second, third, fourth films, reflecting the reality that for many women, opportunities narrow significantly after first release. And it's also important to note that even within that 16% acquired for distribution, the playing field isn't equal. Marginalised filmmakers generally are more likely to be working with smaller production budgets, meaning, as you all well know in this room, smaller marketing budgets and fewer resources for promotion, limiting the audience reach and box office potential those films can achieve. Those films become labelled as risk, and so the cycle continues. And this is where our intervention comes in. And what I want to share with you next is some of the key things we've learned about programming, audience engagement, and what we found it actually takes to make films connect with audiences in practice. First, designing conditions for engagement. Across our work, we found that audiences engage most deeply when the way that a film is presented reflects how it's likely to be experienced, emotionally, socially, and culturally, and when the conditions around the screening are designed with that in mind. Let me share with you 4 examples. With The Outrun, and more recently Hamnet, this has meant extending the experience beyond the screening itself through multisensory participatory events. For The Outrun, this included sound baths, sound walks, creating environments in which audiences could process the film's more difficult themes of addiction through its focus on the sounds of nature. For Hamnet, audiences engaged with apothecary-inspired workshops, tea tastings, craft-based activities, embroidery, printmaking, designed to create space for reflection, conversation, and the creative processing of the film's themes of grief, alongside its exploration of the healing properties of art and nature. And across these events, audiences consistently described the experience as immersive, sensitive, and a perfect way to settle and land after, highlighting the value of experiences that allow audiences to reflect in different ways. With Girls Will Be Girls, a coming-of-age story about a teenage girl navigating desire and identity in a boarding school in North India, the approach centred on cultural and community engagement. Our London screening was paired with post-film collage making workshop using Indian magazines, fabrics, hair oils, and other materials created in partnership with the Vagina Museum. Audiences described the event as feeling inclusive, with a large majority reporting that they would be very likely to recommend their experience. And finally, with An Army of Women, which we toured across the UK, the approach shifted again in response to audience needs. Knowing the film would bring together survivors and those working with support services, we partnered closely with Rape Crisis and with Refuge to create carefully facilitated environments for post-screening conversations with the filmmaker, alongside specialists trained to support potential disclosures safely and responsibly. Audiences commented on the sensitivity with which the events were handled, describing the events, their experiences as powerful, insightful, and gave me hope and made me feel part of something. Overall, across all our Reclaim the Frame events from last year, 95% audiences rated their experience as 4 or 5 out of 5, and 99% are very likely to recommend their experience to a friend. Across these very different campaigns, what these different examples go to show us is how much engagement deepens when the conditions around a film are intentionally designed, and how that shapes who comes into those spaces. Which brings me to the second learning, which is that inclusive programming cultivates new and, importantly, paying audiences. Much of our work at Reclaim the Frame is about reaching underserved audiences, those who don't always feel represented on screen or consistently welcomed into cinema spaces. Because what we found is that inclusive programming doesn't just broaden who attends individual screenings, it brings in new and lapsed audiences, and in doing so, opens up an untapped market. For Girls Will Be Girls, for example, the London screening attracted predominantly young, female, South Asian audience, the majority of whom were new to the venue. For Hamnet, 43% of audiences identified as LGBTQIA, reflecting not a thematic alignment with the film, but the reach of an approach grounded in accessible, sensitive, and participatory event design. And for An Army of Women, 71% of audiences identified as deaf, disabled, and neurodiverse. Again, not because of the subject matter per se, but because the screening conditions made engagement possible. And across the wider programme, our audiences are consistently diverse. Over half identify as disabled, 1/3 global majority, 1/3 LGBTQIA+, and across the board, 1/3 aged under 30. And many of them are new to the kinds of independent cinema venues in which our events are regularly held. So 1/3 are first-time attendees at the venue in question, a further 13% returning after more than a year. So together, that's nearly half that are either new or re-engaging after significant absence. For partner venues, though, as you can imagine, this only matters if it translates into sustained engagement. And the data suggests that it does. Among audiences who do not regularly attend cultural cinema events, 95% report feeling included at Reclaim the Frame event, which matters because inclusion isn't only about who attends, but whether audiences feel fully able to participate when they do. And importantly, this isn't, in the main, subsidised engagement, in the sense that across our public screenings, fewer than 4% of admissions are complimentary tickets, meaning we're attracting a meaningful paying audience. So what we're learning from this is that inclusive programming seems to do more than broaden who attends screenings. It appears to shift who engages with cinema altogether. In practice, this means that we're seeing new, returning, and less frequent audiences coming into cultural cinema spaces, and when the conditions are right, higher levels of reported inclusion and a willingness to pay. Finally, we've learned that audiences come most often to our event through trusted recommendation, whether that's cultural partnerships or community networks, or through the work of our impact producers, freelance marketeers, events producers based across the nations and regions, working closely with local cinemas, groups and networks to build community for the films that we support. For example, collaboration with partners such as Girls on Tops on a limited edition T-shirt, supported by targeted influencer rollout, helped reach culturally engaged audiences for Anne-Marie Jassir's Palestine 36. Partnership with prison reform organisations and Survivor Network supported sold-out screenings of the documentary Holloway, a self-distributed title, across the UK. An impact producer-led outreach to choirs and music groups generated over 3,500 admissions for our recent event to the Testament of Anne Lee. And across the year, these combined efforts contributed to approximately 3.5 million admissions across the titles we supported. So what emerges is a sustained ecosystem of engagement built on trust, where audience discovery is shaped as much by the relationships as by programming, and where cultural partners, community networks, and local advocates play a central role in how the films travel. Audiences also build relationships over the time with our impact producers, their local independent cinema, and through our digital channels, with Reclaim the Frame increasingly acted as a trusted source of recommendations. And this is reflected in the audience behaviour beyond the screening itself, with people sharing events within their own networks and returning for future screenings. Our mailing list grew by over 22% last year. Rather than subscribers, we refer to them as advocates, encouraging them to support and share films ahead of the opening weekend. And our Instagram channel has reached the scale where, for some titles, digital activity alone generates measurable awareness, engagement, and audience conversion. Together, creates a cycle of discovery. Audiences arrive through trusted recommendation, have a positive and inclusive experience, and then become part of the mechanism through which future audiences are brought in. So where do we go from here? With our new release support project, no longer supported by the BFI's Audience Project Fund, what happens next sits with all of us. If this work is to continue at scale, beyond individual projects, and into sustained audience engagement. That 16% figure that I shared with you at the start actually represents a new low and a return to 2018 levels from when we first began tracking releases. At the current rate of change, we'll not reach gender parity in theatrical distribution in the UK and Ireland until 2051. For women screenwriters, that gap extends to 2114. Most of us won't live to see it. So the rollbacks to progress are real. They're already visible in our sector. They're here in this room and in the work that we're all doing. What we've learned through this work is that the barrier is not demand, it's infrastructure and access conditions. And yet what we've shown is that there's already an audience for these films, for films by women and marginalised gender filmmakers, actively engaging with different perspectives in cinema and carrying that engagement forward. So we invite you to join us in this work, in what Ava DuVernay called this movement, not as a statement, but as a practice, to help build and sustain more inclusive, more accessible cinema. And there are a number of ways that we might work together. It could include partnering with us on new release campaigns, programming, outreach. It might mean working with us to connect new and underserved audiences through our networks and trusted community partnerships. And as the charity leading this intervention, our work also relies on continued support. Because the audiences are not missing, they're already here. What we're building together is the infrastructure that allows them to be engaged, included, and involved. So thank you. And please come say hello. I'm here for the rest of today, rest of tomorrow. I'll be around or get in touch. We'd love to continue the conversation and have you join our mission for gender equity in cinema. Thank you.